This talk and the JavaScript for WordPress conference are brought to you by our sponsors at 10up and WP Buffs. 10up makes a better web with finely crafted websites and tools for content creators. Check out their junior and senior dev positions at 10up.com/careers. WP Buffs provides 24/7 fully managed support and white label agency services. Find out how they can help you focus on what you do best at wpbuffs.com/partnerships.
Training your teams, training your successful team, training your team successfully, however you want to put that. I want to help you get the rest of your team as excited about the things that you're learning as you are, so that each of you can advance accordingly. Because teams tend to grow better together than they do when they're apart. And oops, I gotta get clicked onto my slides here. There we go. I think I can skip this slide because we've just gone through the introduction. So the key thing here is I've been working on leading dev teams since 2011 and doing training education almost since then as well. Now, I have 10 platitudes for you for training successful teams, because that is exactly what presentations are about, right? Delivering these platitudes that sound good on paper and are hard to achieve in the real world. And, well, I want to give you some that are actually easy to achieve. So let's just get into it, shall we? Number one, it is important that you and your team get on the same page. You're not going to get very far if each of you are operating from a different playbook, or each of you are sort of considering different things as the most important thing in what you're learning and what you're doing. And I should also pause here that a lot of what I'm talking about is in the context of working with JavaScript and bringing the rest of your team who might not be as familiar with JavaScript on board. But these are also equally applicable to anything that you want your team to learn, anything that you want your team to practice. And getting everyone on the same page is paramount when you are not in the same office together. Distributed teams have quite a few hurdles in front of them in terms of getting everybody in sync. And there are lots of tools now that make this less challenging, like Slack, but then they also bring about their own challenges, like constant interruptions, right? But the key thing here is that you discuss as a team what your goals are with regards to what you want to learn, what you want to do, what you want to build, and make sure that everybody agrees on the priorities, that everybody agrees on sort of which direction you want to head. And then equally important with this is documenting your processes. It's good to make decisions and have everybody agree about those decisions in the moment. It's even better if you can point back to what those decisions were, where you actually remember and can show somebody else, here's what we decided, here's why we decided it, and here's how we went about executing these things. And to give you a practical example here as we talk through this point, think about a framework that you adopted or a project that you were undertaking, and you needed to onboard a new team member. I don't know, many of the teams that I've been on have experienced that, where you get halfway through something and then suddenly there's a new person who needs to learn everything that the rest of the team knows up to that point. And I have historically been bad about enforcing this part of my platitudes here, but document your processes so that when you have to onboard somebody else, or when you come back to an old project, you actually know and remember the decisions that led up to where it is now. And this isn't just for documenting the decision-making processes and the results of those decisions, but also the processes for building a project, for configuring a project. Think about the way that you go to set up the project for the very first time, right? You've just been handed, or someone's just been assigned to a project, and now they need to start contributing. How long is that going to take them? Ideally, it doesn't take them more than a few minutes. But of course, with certain build processes and bringing in dependencies, those are out of our control, right? If someone has to bring down tons of NPM dependencies, set up a virtual environment, etc., it might take them half hour, could even take an hour before all of the assets are loaded. But you don't want that to be time that someone is actively figuring out how to set up the project. That part should be written down so they can just click the README for the project and go, okay, first I need to do this, then I need to do this, now I need to do this. Poof, I now have a perfectly functioning project on my local machine. And I have no questions because everything has been documented for me. Similarly, doing client handoffs, right? You want to document that so that when a client inherits their new project and they have to train new staff members on how to use it, those processes for using the site and using the things that you've built are clear and straightforward and easy to understand. Now, how you document this is going to be largely up to you and the other processes that you already have in your team. One that I really like for code-based projects is just to include that documentation with the code repo itself. Now on GitHub, you could set up wiki pages. We've done that on a number of projects with teams that I've led. But you could also write it in Markdown and include it as part of the project repo itself, so that if you were to ever leave GitHub, for instance, or you're working offline, all of those document processes are still with you, with the project, no matter where you are. I also like this method because GitHub and Bitbucket and most of the other distributed repository solutions will render Markdown as you're browsing the files. So that suits me really well. But regardless of what tools you use, the key thing here is to just do it, right? Write down your decisions, write down why you made them, write down how to set up your projects, write down how to configure something, write down how a feature works, backing up a few steps, writing down how you go about inventing features for projects, right? Here's the process by which we start a project. Document those things so that even people who are rising in the ranks can know, here are the things that I'm going to be responsible for in my next role. All right, I started out as a entry-level dev. Now I'm part of the team. Now I'm leading a team. Now I'm leading multiple teams. It's really handy if you've documented what each of the responsibilities are and how to go about conducting those responsibilities for someone to advance far more quickly, because they know what their next move needs to be. So of all of these, you might find that I'm most passionate about just writing things down and documenting them, because boy, do you forget a lot of things down the road. Now, number 3, it is important that you and your team also think critically about all of the things that you're making. I'm going to press pause here for just a second. Don't just build a thing. When a client comes to you and says, hi, I would like this thing built, don't go, yeah, we will build that, and then go on off and build it. Learn as much as possible about the problem first, and then solve it in a way that will reduce complexity and minimize risk. A lot of times, clients don't strictly know what they want. They have some business needs that need to be met. They have some problems that they're looking to have you solve. And often they will attempt to propose a solution themselves. I am very good at starting to propose solutions right away. But you need to think critically about what it is that you are actually making, to ask probing questions, to drill in deeper to what the actual problem set is. A friend of mine introduced me to this wonderful concept of marinating in the problem space, really understanding what it is that you're trying to solve. And then, as I said, solving it in a way that reduces complexity and minimizes risk. You can make decisions at an extremely rapid pace if the risk that each decision introduces is tiny. If what you're talking about is fundamentally changing the platform or structure of something, those decisions need to be made slowly and with great consideration. But if the decisions you're making are, well, if this doesn't work, we'll spend another couple of hours trying this next solution, I will encourage my team to work through those decisions as fast as they can. And in fact, empower them to just make a call without involving me or anybody else, as long as they've documented why they chose a certain thing. Because even more frustrating than not understanding why a certain solution was picked is not knowing which other solutions had been tried and why they were or were not rejected. So don't just document what you are doing, document what you did and what didn't work, and make decisions as quickly as you can while thinking critically about the problems and implementing solutions that are as uncomplex and non-risky as you can manage. And you'll see how this ties back to training in a few slides from now. Next, it is also paramount that you and your team adopt similar tooling. And I mean across your team itself for what tools you're using and working with, but also across your projects so that insofar as possible, all of your projects are using similar tool sets. And the reason for this is because it is so much easier to train and onboard new team members when everybody is generally using the same things and all of your projects are generally built in the same way. Now, I know from years of experience on being on teams and leading teams myself that you're not going to be able to make every project the same because projects are necessarily different. They're meeting different needs. They're for different clients who have different requirements. Even two projects that are ultimately the same product aren't necessarily going to be built in the same way, especially at the enterprise level, because there are other factors involved that will change the requirements, both for what tooling you're allowed to use and how you go about implementing a particular solution. But casting all of those outliers aside, for 80% of your projects, you should be able to have similar build processes and use similar build tools to make everything work. And ideally, you're using as much third-party, well-documented and supported tooling as possible. Because if you start making your own tooling, which I understand is very attractive for, well, if we just build this thing, then we have it and we can use it forever, doesn't always work out the way you expect because now you have a new tool that someone is responsible for maintaining. And I promise you that you did not get into business to maintain a bunch of internal tools that you now have through a week of training to understand all of these tools that are unique to your business. Instead, use off-the-shelf tooling and document how you use that particular tool so that everybody else can be brought up to speed as quickly as possible. If you want some great advice on different JavaScript build tools, go back and watch Julian's session from earlier here in track 2 on the JavaScript build tools. He did a really great job, and there are many, many, many to discuss and many pros and cons to each of them, and I thought he laid them out pretty well. For non-JavaScript tooling, right, I'm talking about your coding environment, though it's absolutely not important that everybody on the team uses the same coding tool. And by that, I mean the software in which they're writing code, whether they're using a full-on IDE like VS Code or PHP Storm, or just a run-of-the-mill text editor like Sublime Text or Atom or any of the others. I find it's best that developers use whatever tools they're most comfortable with in that sense. But for other things, like what you're using to actually run the build and manage dependencies in your projects, those should be universal across the team. And if you can manage it, the tools that you're using for instantiating a local environment should also be standardized. Because, once again, going back to the onboarding new team members and training other team members, it's so much faster if you can just say, here's what we use for our local environments, and here's why, and here's how. They can get up to speed so much more quickly. And if you're looking for a better local development solution, one that I've been experimenting with recently is called Lando. Excuse me, Lando, like Lando Calrissian from Star Wars. And what I like about it specifically is that it's Docker-based, like many other great solutions, but you can include the configuration for your local environment in your project repo. So when someone clones the repo for the project, they can instantiate a nice local environment all right from that. And you can script that entire process of pulling down the repo, rather making a directory, pulling down the repo, and propping up that local development environment using Lando pretty easily, which is neat. It's still in beta, so you may want to shy away from it for a while. I understand that. Just letting you know that it exists. The takeaway, though, is get everybody on the same page with that and adopt similar tooling where it matters and let people make their own decisions where it doesn't. Number 5, it's important that you plan for exploration and experimentation. You can do all sorts of things to say, here's our standard for creating a project. But if you say this is the only way we're going to do it, you're going to sell yourself short. So when you're estimating projects, if you're responsible for that part of the thing, make sure you bake in some hours for team members to explore ideas and experiment with things. Don't just say, oh, well, we've built this before. It took this long. We'll just build something exactly the same for your project. Say, well, we built one of these and it will take that long to make, but let's add some more hours to it and see if we can come up with an even better solution than what we implemented the last time. I've found that providing opportunity and space for my colleagues to try new ideas and share what they're learning helped us way, way more than just about anything else that we could do. And by just about anything else, I'm talking about reading books together, going to conferences together or independently, and trying to share from that knowledge. Because the things that you're learning are useful, and clearly you realize that, and you're making time to do that right now. But it's not until you start implementing the things that you're learning that it really starts to stick, and you turn that knowledge into actual wisdom. So make sure that you're planning time in your day, that you're advocating for time in other people's days to explore and experiment what they're working with. And with this, you gain the opportunity to master interactions and create experiences. So bringing it back to JavaScript, what I mean here is you're not just writing the same basic JavaScript as everybody else has for creating flyout menus or accordions or things like that, but you're leaving space to think through, how can we improve the visitor experience of this? How can we improve our customer experience or the administrative experience for working with this thing that we've made? And those kinds of solutions usually only come up as you're experimenting with things. Once in a while, you'll hit a great idea as you're having your morning coffee, in the shower, out for a walk, away from your computer. But in my experience, the best conclusions, the best happy accidents happen as I'm building one thing and go, well, what if I tried this instead? Or what if I tweaked this thing here? And just kept iterating again and again and again on an idea until I finally landed on, I think this is the right way to solve it. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, the next time I want to use that thing, I budget more time to continue iterating on it, because I know that I haven't gotten the absolute best solution here. I found one of many possible good solutions, and perhaps if I iterate on it a little bit more in this project, it will be all the more better for that time spent. So plan time for experimentation and exploration. Number 6, enforce coding standards. Now this one's a bit touchy for a lot of people, so I'm going to try and be as I'll say non-religious as I can be here. I don't really care what standards you adopt and enforce. What matters is that you pick some standards and enforce them, because you're a decent human being and you should have standards. And I'm not just talking about code formatting standards, though those are very important. A study was conducted a bunch of years ago that found the most statistically significant indicator for bug density in code was inconsistent spacing. So having formatting standards is important, but you as a human don't need to enforce those, because we have tools that can enforce those, like PHP Code Sniffer and lots of other things that once your team says, yep, these are the standards we're going to use, you just codify that, you document your process, and now everybody knows these are the standards we follow, here's why, and here's how we get them set up. What I really want you to focus on here are coding practices. Enforce coding standards in your coding practices. Here is our philosophical approach to solving these kinds of problems. Here is what we as a team believe is the right approach to working on this, or the wrong approach. and document those and try to enforce them as much as possible. A specific example might be, as a team, you don't want to introduce animations to very many things in the browser, because while playful and neat, your experience has shown that any animations that you add to a site tend to create a larger page weight, right? Because you're writing additional CSS or additional JavaScript, and it's taking away from the core experience of what you're trying to do, and it's more time spent on the fringe of the project, and it's more time that all of the visitors have to spend waiting for an animation to finish. And so, as a general rule, you as a team don't support interaction animations in your design. From a separate perspective, maybe you've done a lot of research and you found, hey, we found that the right amount of animation on a few key elements in this design actually enhance the user experience. They provide a bit of affordance, kind of like the shaking back and forth animation in the login form on WordPress when you accidentally use the wrong password. And so we are going to use we are going to use animations in the sites that we're building, but here's how we're going to use them, and here's why we're going to do it, and here's some additional constraints around when we will or won't use animations. Another similar but different example, maybe you as a team only want to use front-end JavaScript for progressive enhancement. So you don't want to build a site that is dependent on JavaScript. You're thinking about accessibility first. You're thinking about not just people who are using assistive tech, but people who are on lower quality connections or less capable devices. And so you want to use JavaScript sparingly so that when it is available, when people do have the bandwidth or what have you, their experience is improved with JavaScript. But if they don't have JavaScript, they're still getting an excellent experience. These are the kinds of standards that you need to document and explain to the team and get everybody on the same page for using. Also for debating and arguing, because healthy argument and conversation around your standards is important. In fact, I believe that your standards should change from time to time as your understanding of the code that you're working with, as your practices evolve. You should be coming back and revisiting your standards and evaluating, is this still useful to us? Do we need to do something different here? And things like that. Excuse me. And hand in hand with that, focus on syntax and style with your coding standards and with other things. As you, as a team, are growing together and talking about projects, I've found that it's very handy to, and when you're learning about things specifically, I found that it's very handy to focus on the syntax and style of what you're learning. This goes in hand with my next point, which we'll get to in just a minute. But focusing on the style of the code that you're studying to understand why it was written in a particular way, why your code is written in a particular way, is a really handy thing to pull from as you're trying to teach other team members. So it's not just, here's a function that I wrote, here's what it does, and here's why I wrote it this way, but here's why I wrote it this way. Here's why I solved the problem like this. You may have noticed at this point that I've used the term why a lot on these slides. And the why of what you're building, I find to be almost more important than the what of what you're building. Because developers, in my experience, will debate until the end of time about how to do something or what you need to build it. But when you introduce them to why a certain thing is being built a certain way, those arguments become far less relevant and far less prevalent, because you get right to the heart of, oh, all right, so we need this feature to behave in this way to solve this business need. Now I understand why you asked me to build it in this way. I still don't think this is the best approach, though. Here's what I'd like to do instead, and here's why I think we should do it this way. That's a far more constructive and useful conversation to have with a team that you're training or that's training you than, I built it this way because it's faster. Oh, okay, cool. Like speed is important. Speed is a feature of a website, and speed is a feature of a team. But what is faster? Why did you take this approach because that was faster versus this other approach that I asked for that's perhaps slightly slower but solves these other problems? And they go, oh, well, I didn't think about those other problems. We didn't talk about those problems. This is why I keep circling back to why. Here's why we're making it this way, because how we're doing it or what we're making might change, but why we're making it a particular way usually doesn't. Or when it does, it changes for a very good reason, because now you've had a conversation about the core of what matters here, why a certain thing needs to exist or doesn't need to exist. Similarly, when we're talking about code, rather than just debating, well, here's how I would do it, or here's this other thing, bringing in some additional context around that, like the style of the code or the particular syntax that a person is using, matters. Rather than saying like, well, we write Yoda conditionals because of, we do, saying, well, we tend to write Yoda conditionals where we reverse things and say, if true equals whatever, because we found that we were missing a lot of equals and then creating true statements in our conditional statement, which always showed true, which always ran this thing. Explaining the why behind some of your standards, and framing that around the coding style for clarity tends to get a lot more buy-in a lot more quickly. So hand in hand with that, as I said, number 8, skip the framework du jour. Don't just jump into whatever framework sounds most interesting to the rest of the team because it's the new hotness. In my experience, I found a lot of success by focusing on the thing that was cool 2 years ago that's still being widely used and talked about today, because those things are now extremely well documented and extremely well tested, versus the one that just came out now that a few people are using and are talking about how great it is, but has it been used in a production environment like ours yet? What happens when it gets combined with this other thing, where you sort of have to forge the path and make your own trail? You lose a lot of time there on things that probably shouldn't be your responsibility to figure out. Whereas if you pick up a framework that's been in use for a couple of years, you're going to get a lot of things for free. Like I said, the documentation, the testing, etc. Now, I'm painting with broad strokes here. So when it makes even more sense to skip straight to the newest stuff, do that, right? This isn't a hard and fast rule. I'm just saying, generally speaking, you'll find that things are a lot easier if you're working with what the new hotness was 2 years ago than what the new hotness is today. React, for example, is a perfect framework to start learning because it is multiple years old now and has been battle tested by many people, documented by many people, etc. Vue, and all of the other frameworks out there, right? Angular even, all of these are now old news and still work extremely well. But you might not want to pick up whatever the next iteration is that someone's building on top of React just yet, because maybe it dies 6 months from now and you've spent so much time going like, oh yes, this makes so much more sense. This is gonna be great for all of these things. And oh my gosh, where did the developers go? Where's the rest of the community? Everybody abandoned it. And now you have one lone project that's just an island in the sea of all of your other projects that was built differently because it uses a different framework. So as you start to pick up frameworks and use them, definitely do that, right? Like I said several slides back, don't just go about building all of your own tooling, because now you have tons of your own tooling that you have to maintain, except when it makes sense to build your own tooling and you do want to take on the burden of maintaining it, because it's better than picking up a framework that might dissolve 2 weeks from now. As you start picking up these frameworks and integrate them into your projects, you're probably going to do it slowly, but I encourage you to find the things that you know you're going to use on more than one project. So you don't ever end up with these weird one-off island projects, but you have multiple projects that were built around the same time that all use the same frameworks, the same tooling, that's all been documented so that whoever comes to pick up this project 6 months from now or 2 years from now knows, okay, here's what it was using, here's why it's using that. Now I have the context that I need in order to fix this one particular feature. Number 9, divide responsibilities. This is important in a number of different contexts. So we could talk about dividing responsibilities between components in JavaScript, right? Or across the functions that you're writing in PHP or anything, right? You want one thing to have one purpose. And if it has any more than one purpose, it should be 2 things. And each of those things should have one purpose. Similarly with your team, dividing responsibilities amongst your team members so that each person has their own distinct responsibilities that ideally don't overlap with somebody else's, so that everybody knows who's responsible for what, and so that you can manage expectations to say, this is the area that you're going to own, and here are the success conditions for that. This is the area that I'm going to own, and the success conditions for that. And I'm going to build this thing in this way because I know that you're going to use it in this other part of the project, and it needs to accept these inputs and produce these outputs. A lot of this is computer science 101 stuff that I just said in that example. But it's also important to divide responsibilities in regards to training. It's probably not a great idea to have just a single person responsible for being the driving force in training and continuing education in your team. It's far better if everybody is involved in some capacity, whether that means having one person responsible for scheduling different training opportunities and presenting different training ideas, and other people responsible for bringing that training to the forefront, or whether it just means cycling through so that each person is responsible for the thing at a different point in time. And an example of what I'm describing here is like internal presentations. One person gives a presentation this month, a different person gives a presentation next month, and so on. Each person has been given the distinct responsibility of bringing something to train and educate the rest of the team. And they are responsible for that for a specific period of time. And going back to the code, just to drive the point home further, it's so much better if you have clearly divided relationships and responsibilities for the business logic, the presentation layer, and everything else in your code, which I imagine most people who are here watching this agree with, and I'm not going to belabor that point any. Next, practice adaptability. This one is probably the most important of my platitudes, because if you try to implement anything that I've said and try and hold fast to whatever that is, you're going to be very disappointed a year from now when you've reached irrelevance. So do your best to train your team for today and the near term while remaining adaptable. Going back to point number 5, allow for experimentation and exploration. Set up your standards, but allow the team to deviate from them with good reason and explain why they deviated from those standards, and perhaps then incorporate that into the standards. You don't have to have these standards existing in a vacuum. That'd be a very bad idea, because as your team evolves and grows, so should your standards, so should the ideas about what you're building evolve, because the web is constantly moving and evolving, and so we must move and evolve with it. Some other areas where you might want to practice adaptability is in how you want your team to be learning things. So there's this generally well-regarded bit of wisdom that people learn differently from one another, right? Certain people are tactile learners, kinesthetic learners. People like to read from a book or watch a movie, and everybody has different ways where they go about learning things. But it turns out we all kind of learn in the same way. We take in information, we have different preferences for how we take that information in, but then we commit it to knowledge and remember it and find value in it when we actually do whatever it is that we're learning about. I also mentioned that earlier on. And so it's good to help your team become more comfortable with different mediums for acquiring knowledge. So Maybe that's a podcast that you want everybody to listen to. Maybe it's an article you want them to read, or a book you want them to read, or a video you want them to watch, or a presentation you want to deliver to them, or want them to study and deliver to you and the rest of the team. It's good for you to be flexible and adaptable to all of the things that are coming, but it's even better for the rest of the team to be flexible and adaptable, so that as business requirements change in a project, they don't lose hope that, well, I just spent a week working on this feature, and now you tell me that all of that is useless and we have to build this other thing. And you go, yes, I'm afraid that's true, but don't think of that time as a waste, because hopefully you were learning different ideas while writing that code. And what this is an opportunity for us to better support our customer whose own business needs have changed. That's why this requirement changed, and that's why we're now building this new thing. And from this, we now have a new contract with them that brings in more revenue for the business, which means more opportunities for us to have time off, more opportunities for us to invest in the team, things like that. So be flexible, be adaptable, work with your team, work with your clients. Try to foster this learning mentality of focusing on why and using that to sort of direct the thrust of the what and how that you're working on. And a bonus platitude here, number 11, make learning a habit. It's great that you want to learn things, and it's great that you have a team who's interested in learning things, but I find that that excitement sort of wanes as time goes on. You want to learn these things, and other people want to learn these things, and they go, that kind of sucked. I don't want to do that anymore. I'm going to go back to doing this other thing. But if you make learning a habit in the same way that other people who are more athletic than me make exercise a habit, or how you've made eating breakfast or eating lunch a habit, you and the rest of the team are going to be so much better off. Think about where you want the team to be a year from now, and think about all of the other things that have to be true to reach that point, and then codify that and make it part of your routine. So if you want the team to understand React, for example, you want everybody who's working on the front end or the back end of the site to understand React well enough that as a team, you could start building your own React packages. You could have a fully React-powered website, and everybody understands all of the facets of it. It's a pretty tall order, right? Because you've got people who are at different skill levels, who have different familiarity with JavaScript itself, as well as React and other modern frameworks. And so how do you get everybody who's all at different points in their career to eventually reach the same point of like, oh yeah, we all get it, and our knowledge has meshed? You get there by setting different milestones and by implementing different opportunities to learn and to practice, so that everyone has the opportunity to make this part of their core knowledge. And so in your company, this might look like having one afternoon per week where everybody is learning something, though I found that that is kind of hard to implement in some cases because different people need to be in different meetings for different reasons, right? Because of client schedules. So perhaps rather than saying everybody gets together on Monday afternoon or Tuesday afternoon, and for 4 hours, we're each independently learning what's important to us. Instead, you say 4 hours of every person's week must have a training component to it. When they do those 4 hours is less important, as long as they do them as one cohesive block where they're not being interrupted. So some people might do it on Mondays, other people might do it on Thursdays, whatever works. But make it a habit. Get buy-in from the executive team, get buy-in from the production staff, from operations. Make sure that everybody agrees this is what we want to do, so that you actually do it. And if you slip some weeks, don't just say, well, learning wasn't for us, because that would be a very terrible conclusion to draw from this. Say, man, this is hard. How can we better protect this time and make sure that as a team, we are valuing what we're learning and making time to do that? So make it a habit. And if you want to see all 11 of these platitudes. Here they are together. I'll review them with you. Get on the same page. Document your processes. Think critically. Adopt similar tooling. Plan for exploration and experimentation. Enforce coding standards. Focus on syntax and style. Skip the framework du jour. Divide responsibilities. Practice adaptability, and make learning a habit. Whew. Well, there are all of those. Before I part, I want to make sure that the rest of you are aware, and I asked Zach because I felt kind of weird doing this. You should check out wordsesh.com because WordSesh is coming back in July, almost exactly 1 month from now. And there are a bunch of great speakers, and clearly you like virtual conferences because you're attending one right now. And the platform for it is going to be very familiar to you because it's exactly what we're using here today for the JavaScript for WordPress conference. And you can check out the full speaker list and everything else at wordsesh.com. I'll leave this slide on screen for just a few more seconds so that you don't forget that it's just wordsesh.com. And then I will now flip back to all 11 of my platitudes together in case you wanted to write those down. And if you miss out on writing them down, don't worry. I'm about to drop the link to this entire slide deck into Slack so that you have it. And I guess I just realized I didn't mention it at all. I run WPSessions.com, where I do training like this all of the time. And very poorly documented and very poorly advertised is the fact that I also provide custom curriculums to teams. So if you're on a team, no matter how big or small your team is, even if you're a team of one, I also offer private training and consultation. And you can just go to wpsessions.com and contact me through the contact form there, and I can give you more information about that. And with that, I am done with my prepared material. I'm going to turn over to Slack and see what questions are here. And I'm going to scroll back here. I don't see any mentions in the channel, so I didn't miss anything there. And I see 2 replies to the comment that I said to thread your questions in. And Andrew Taylor, love that guy, says, I can really relate to what Brian is talking about with the need to document for client handoff. We had a project where we used Sass, compiled the CSS. The client didn't know or understand and edited the CSS directly. Yep. And next time they went to make changes and rebuilt the CSS, poof, there goes everything that the customer had tweaked, which is not a fun position to be in. I have had a similar experience, and I can share in your agony, Andrew. And then Birgit says, awesome, can you apply some of your wisdom? When you talk about planning for time of exploration experiments, how would you go about in the context of a client project? And have you found that to get to a formula like factor 1.2 or 2.2 added to the discovery hours, or what might be a good approach? Yes, so how do you actually bake in time for exploration and experimentation? I can't give you an exact formula because I've sort of changed my method over time, but I like adding a few hours here and there to different tasks. Obviously, the bigger the task, the bigger the feature, the more time you want to add. I would say, in general, about another 20% of time to a particular thing is going to give you enough time to sort of think through and experiment. And you might not want to just add 20% to the entire contract because now you're bidding at a much higher rate than perhaps the client was expecting, and you might not get the job at all. So adding pockets of time to experiment on specific features is the approach that I like the best. And to give you a more concrete example of that, imagine that the client wants you to build a system for displaying a product inventory, right? They've got a catalog of things. It's not an e-commerce site. They just have, say, 100, 200 things that they want to show off, and they want to have faceted search so you can, narrow the results by category or by price range or by whatever. And you've built something like this before, or you haven't, but regardless, you realize like it's probably going to take us about 20 hours to make all of the functionality for this, and then another 10 hours to get the design the way we want it perhaps we're using Facet WP, maybe we're making a custom thing, whatever, right? You've figured out, here's how much time it would take to make this thing and get what the client needs. But now let's add another day to that, another 8 hours, or if you've got 2 people, another 16 hours for them to just iterate and explore and experiment with different ideas for how perhaps the interactions on that faceted navigation should work, or the best way, to handle clearing out the tags that have been applied to their faceted search or what have you. I think about larger features and put my opportunity for experimentation there. Another concrete example, my team had to build a website for a lighting magazine, like a magazine that talks about light bulbs and other lighting solutions. And we thought it would be fun to have a toggle on the site where you could toggle lights out mode. And so it goes from being a bright background with dark text to being a dark background with bright text. And we just baked in a few extra hours on the project to experiment and play with that idea. We hadn't even talked to the client about putting it into the site, but they liked it enough and said, that's actually pretty fun. Let's make that part of our actual site. And so we actually changed the scope of the project from the extra hours that we added on just to experiment. And we wanted to do that so we could see different ideas and approaches for, well, how do we want to handle this toggle? What CSS and JavaScript do we need to have to support it? Cookies, local storage, what have you. What are some new techniques that we want to learn and see if they'll be useful for other projects in a safe way with a net. So hopefully that answers your question, Birgit. And I think I saw someone ping me in Slack. Make learning habit. Yep. No question, just a comment. Thank you, Christina. And that's all I've got.
Thanks for watching this talk from the JavaScript for WordPress conference. If you're interested in more talks like this, head over to javascriptforwp.com/conference to see an archive of all talks, as well as information about upcoming events.